The overhead press is an effective exercise for training overall upper body strength, but overhead press technique can be a struggle. There are several commonly made mistakes with the overhead press that can hold your strength back and potentially lead to discomfort. Next to form mistakes, it's also common for people to struggle with progressively overloading the overhead press. The overhead press seems to be one of those exercises that is very stubborn in terms of progress for many people. So in today's video, I will discuss overhead press technique by showing you 6 form corrections, and I will also go into how you can make better progress on the overhead press with more structured training programming. But first, let's look into the specific muscles that an overhead press emphasizes. The overhead press is oftentimes also coined a shoulder press, which is for good reason because we know from research that an overhead press targets the shoulder muscles well, specifically the front deltoids. Your triceps also get worked well in this vertical push exercise, and also the serratus anterior gets worked hard during the overhead press. The serratus is often known as the boxer's muscle. When your scapula rotates upward during an overhead press, the serratus anterior will stabilize the shoulder. And this brings us to mistake number 1 on the overhead press, and that is purposely locking your shoulder blades whenever you do the overhead press. When you lock your scapula, you take the serratus anterior muscle that we just discussed out of the picture, and the serratus actually contributes to your strength on the overhead press. So let your scapula move freely whenever you do the overhead press. This trains a larger group of muscles, increases your range of motion, and improves strength potential. I think this mistake stems from the barbell bench press, in which we sometimes lock the scapula on the bench to better stabilize yourself. But with the overhead press, this should be avoided. For stronger and stable shoulders, we use a complete range of motion in which your shoulder blades can move upward at the end of an overhead press. The second form correction is related to your grip width. It's common for people to maintain quite a wide grip on the overhead press. This is fine if you're using the overhead press to improve your Olympic lifts. But for general muscle and strength development, having a more narrow grip width that allows your hands to be positioned over your elbows puts you in a more efficient position to overhead press the weight. When your forearms are vertical to the floor at the bottom of an overhead press, the barbell has to travel less distance, and it puts your shoulders at a more advantageous position to lift the weight up. This is because the moment arm between your hands and shoulders is lower, resulting in better force transfer. Setting up your hands just slightly outside of shoulder width when placed on the bar is a good aim for most people. The third form correction is related to bar path, and especially in beginner trainees, it is common for people to press the bar forward or make a half circle when they overhead press the weight. But for the most efficient bar path, aim to press the weight straight up. The barbell has to travel less distance, and it puts your shoulder in a stronger position. When you press the weight forward, the barbell moves away from your midline, and this reduces the strength potential of your shoulders. That's why you see all people with a strong overhead press pressing the barbell straight up and not in front of them. Now, it's possible that some people cannot press the weight straight up because of shoulder mobility issues, because this exercise does require good overhead shoulder mobility. If you notice you are having tight shoulders before an overhead press, use the wall shoulder slides and banded shoulder dynamic stretch before overhead pressing. These dynamic stretches help enhance overhead mobility, resulting in you being able to complete an overhead press with proper range of motion. Correction number 4 is one that you may see a lot in the gym, and that is turning your overhead press into a push press. I like the push press exercise, but it's a different movement than the overhead press. One is used for training explosivity, while the other is a strength and hypertrophy focused exercise. We want to limit momentum use on the overhead press if we want to get the full muscle development benefits. So whenever you do the overhead press, prevent significant movement at your hips or knees. We want your muscles to move the weight, not momentum. The next form correction is about your pelvis position, because it's also common for people to experience some low back discomfort after they do the overhead press. This typically happens when you overhead press with an overly curved back. A simple correction for this is squeezing your glutes during the overhead press. When you squeeze the glutes, your back will be in a neutral position and you have a strong base to press from. If you struggle with keeping the glutes squeezed during an overhead press, then incorporate movements like a hollow body hold and glute bridges into your warm-up routine, because they reinforce the neutral position of your pelvis. The sixth and last form correction is about your wrist positioning during an overhead press, because having some wrist discomfort is also common during the overhead press. If you grip the barbell with a thumbless grip or place the bar high in your hands, your wrist will likely bend backward. This causes your hands to move behind the bar, resulting in an excessive stretch on your wrist while performing the overhead press. By laying the bar lower on your hand, closer to the base of your thumbs, you force your wrists into a more neutral position. This ensures you don't excessively bend your wrist while overhead pressing and can more comfortably complete the lift. So now that we have discussed the form corrections, let's look into how you can improve your overhead pressing strength. And by definition, these form corrections also help you improve overhead press strength, because an overhead press done correctly is more efficient. But there are also some training programming aspects we should take into consideration. 3 specific tips come to mind. First, we have exercise order. The overhead press is commonly trained after other push exercises like the flat or incline bench press. But we know from research that the exercises you train first in your session make the most strength progress. So if you want to focus on overhead press strength, prioritize this exercise in your training by performing it first. Also, try training the overhead press multiple times per week. Strength is a skill. The more you practice the overhead press, the more skill and efficiency you gain in your overhead press. Doing the overhead press 2 times per week instead of once per week is helpful. Just be sure to balance out your training by having a pull movement for every push movement in your routine to get balanced shoulder development. And the last performance tip is to train the overhead press in multiple rep ranges. Instead of only training in the 8 to 12 rep range, also dabble into lower 3 to 6 rep ranges while overhead pressing. This allows you to practice lifting heavier weights on the overhead press, and the lower reps promote faster strength development. Up until this point, we only discussed the standing barbell overhead press, but there are of course also other vertical push exercises you can use in your training. If for some reason you just can't seem to get the overhead press right or you don't enjoy it, you can also do something like a seated dumbbell shoulder press. With the seated dumbbell shoulder press, your back is placed against the bench, which reduces the extent to which your core needs to stabilize your body during the shoulder press. For shoulder training, this has the benefit that you can fully focus on training your vertical push without being limited by core strength. The fact that with dumbbells each arm trains individually also helps you reduce muscle imbalances between each shoulder. And there are more shoulder press variations we can consider. For instance, the seated barbell press and standing dumbbell press. Based on research, you typically are the strongest with seated barbell pressing since it is the most stable variation of a shoulder press. Like always, experiment with the different variations and you will be able to find out what suits your training needs best. And that was all for today's video. I hope you now have practical tips on how you can improve your overhead press technique and performance. If you found this video helpful, then leave me a thumbs up. Also subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. And I will see you in the next video.